Knights are one of the most interesting pieces on the chessboard, in my opinion, because of the way they move. So they move in the weird L shape. And then when you pair that with the fact that they can jump over pieces, you just get this interesting dynamic that you don't have with other pieces. They're also one of the more difficult for our brains to understand how they move. For some reason, it's very easy to understand that rooks move in straight lines, bishops follow the diagonals, but knights, the L shape is just a little bit more challenging. So you put all those things together and you have a very interesting piece. I remember growing up, the knights were always my favorite piece. I just really liked the way they moved and I liked using them. And I used to have moments where I wouldn't want to trade them even for bishops, which technically speaking, it's good to trade your knights for bishops a lot of times. But growing up, I didn't want to do it. Anyway, in this video, we're going to look at 10 ways that you can effectively use your knights in chess. Let's go ahead and get started. And by the way, the reason I have this position on the board is because knight d6 is checkmate, because the pawn can't capture, because the queen is pinning it. Really nice smothered mate. This is a trap that comes out of the Caro-Kann. I made a video on this, I think, before, where I talked about some traps in the Caro-Kann. You can check that out if you want. But let's get started. All right, so the number one way to use your knights, and I think most people know this, but it's to do forks. So as a reminder, forks are when you attack two pieces at the same time. So in this example, we can go knight c7. We're forking the king and the queen, and we're going to win, basically win black's queen. And the interesting thing about knights, like I mentioned, is because they can jump over pieces. It doesn't matter like what is around you. If you can get your knight on the correct square, it's going to be able to create the fork every single time, because the knight can always jump over whatever might be in between. So that's what sets the knight apart from other pieces. Every piece on a chessboard can do forks, but the knights are extremely effective for the reason I just mentioned. Now, of course, when you're forking pieces, you want to be looking for high valued pieces. So for example, here the knight is attacking the king and the queen, which are the two most valuable pieces on the board. So this is a very good fork, but it's also attacking these pawns. But the fact that it's attacking these pawns really means nothing to us, because we wouldn't want to really take, maybe this pawn, we might want to take that, but we wouldn't want to take this one because it's defended by a pawn. We'd be giving up our knight for a pawn. It doesn't make sense, right? So when you're looking for opportunities to fork with your knight, make sure you're looking at the high valued pieces, specifically the king, the queen, or the rooks. Those are usually going to be your best options. And sometimes you can do forks on low value pieces, but the important thing is that both of the pieces are undefended. And if that's true, well, then you can do the fork with the knight and still win a piece, but they have to be undefended. If these pawns were defended, this fork wouldn't make sense, like the last example. Now, while we're talking about forks, at the start of the game, the knight forks that you want to be aware of are always going to happen, not always, but most of the time they're going to happen on f7 or c7. So I want to give you guys an example. One of my first games ever in a tournament, I didn't really know too much, but my opponent played bishop f4. I think I played knight f6. They played knight c3, and I played knight c6. I knew enough that, like, okay, let's put my pawns in the center and develop my pieces, but I wasn't aware of this one little idea, and that guy played knight to b5, and I was in big trouble, okay? Now, the best thing that I could have done would probably block with this pawn, sacrifice the pawn, and then the position would get a little bit tricky, and I could save myself, but I didn't see that or didn't want to play that in the game. And I think what I ended up doing was bringing this bishop out, allowing them to get this fork, moving my king, and then taking the knight back. And I really got off to a bad start, right? Like my king couldn't castle. I lost my rook for the knight. Not how you want to start the game, right? So this is important to remember. If your opponent lines up one of their bishops and brings the knight out, you have to watch out for that. You have to at least plan how are you going to deal with that before it's too late, right? In my case, I didn't plan ahead, and then once it happened, it was too late. Okay, so better option would have been to play c6. This is a good move. It dominates the knight, so the knight can't move forward now. Or I could have developed this bishop somewhere, and then if he would have played knight to b5, I have knight a6, right? And this is a pretty nice way to deal with that. And then I could play c6 next move with tempo, kick the knight away after something like this, and then probably just drop my knight back to c7 and the game goes on, right? And I didn't have to deal with that fork, okay? So those are the two, I would say, best and easiest ways to deal with that. You either play c6 or you make sure that you have your knight available to go to a6 to defend the attack on c7, okay? The other thing, this could also happen on the other side of the board, right? So same kind of deal. And if you play knight f6, this is the two knights defense. And if you allow this, you have to be willing to go into either a fried liver, or you have to know the main line of the two knights, which is after they capture here, you have to know what to do about knight a5. This is kind of the, let me back up. There's two ways you can approach this. Option one, you can just capture the pawn, but then you allow white to play the fried liver attack. Very, very dangerous. and you really have to know what you're doing if you're going to play that. Or probably a little bit more common is you play knight to a5 here. This is the main line of the two knights defense, and then usually bishop b5 check, c6, takes. The bishop can go, I think the main line might be bishop e2, but it can go to a couple different places. You have to know this as well, right? But the point is, you know, watch out that this is a real threat. Okay, it's just the way that the pieces are placed. It's very easy for the knights to do this, and you always have two high-valued pieces that once they get there, they're going to be attacking, right? The rook and the queen, or in the case on this side, it's going to be the king and the rook. Okay, so keep that in mind. Watch out for those and understand what your options are for stopping this. Okay, and if you, by the way, if you don't like the two knights defense for whatever reason, you can always play bishop c5, and this is not an option right away because you would just take it with the queen. If they play like d3 and then go for it later, well, now you can simply castle and you're good, because this is not a good trade for white, right? You just have the rook and you're fine. All right, so that's how you can deal with that. All right, so those are just some tips that you want to keep in mind when we're talking about forks with knights. All right, so the second thing we're going to talk about is what are the best opening squares for your knights. So there's a rule that you don't want to put knights on the rim. A knight on the rim is grim, or a knight on the rim is dim, whichever version you've heard. So you want to try to avoid putting your knights there, and almost always, if you can, you want to go to these two squares. So sometimes people will do things like put their knight like here, and it's not a bad thing, but as a general rule, it's just better on f3 and c3. It controls both central squares that could be useful to you, whereas e2, you're only really controlling one central square. You're not putting pressure on black's pawn. And same thing over here. This is going to be much better because you're not only defending your pawn, you're also putting pressure where black might like to strike in the center. So if you can, you want to put both knights there, and that's why you'll see a lot of openings where both players do this, right? And so this is the ideal square for your knight. Occasionally, it makes sense. You know, if you really want your knight to stay on c3, you could put your other knight here to defend it if you're expecting black to capture you. But like I said, as a general rule, go for these two squares for your knights if you can. All right, the third thing I want to talk about is knights can be very effective if they are side by side. So here's an example where we have some very basic moves. Both players are just kind of developing. Not too much has happened. And white decides, you know what, I'd like to attack black's king. And so they play the move knight to e2. And then, I don't know, let's say black plays rook e8. They play the move knight to g3. Okay, this is maneuvering the knight over to the king side, getting ready to attack. Notice how the knights are side by side. And what you get is this very interesting dynamic where they control all of these squares. Look at this, right? And it kind of makes this pattern where you just get lots of control over the board and you have lots of options. And so putting your knights side by side can be very effective and make it difficult on your opponent. And this is a very easy thing to do. You just spend two moves, maneuver your knight around. Another way that you could have done this would have been to move your queen and then drop the knight back here and go to this square. And you have both knights side by side. You get lots of control over the center, right? Like, let's say you went here. I don't know. I'm just making some random moves for black. And again, you get this pattern, right, where you have all this control over these central squares, right? So very effective way to use your knights. And don't be afraid, you know, to a lot of people, I think they get a position like this and they don't realize, like, you know what, it's okay to like maneuver your knights around to whatever you're trying to accomplish. I mean, you could attack on the queen side too, and you know, you maneuver this side around, right? So don't be afraid to do that. Maneuver them around, and side by side gives you lots of options and you get a lot of control over that side of the board. All right, so the next three tips that I'm going to give you about the knights have to do with defending. So when you're trying to defend in certain situations, and the first one that we're going to talk about is when you're defending against a queen. So in this position, let's say black plays the move queen to e3 check, and you have to make a decision. Are you going to run with your king somewhere? Are you going to block? What are you going to do? Now, one option would be to block with the bishop. And if you block with the bishop, you still have to worry about queen e5 check, queen e1 check, queen g1 check. You're going to have to calculate all that. You're going to have to plan what's going to happen after those checks happen. Now, this might be a fine move. I don't know. But I want to show you what happens if you block with the knight. Can the queen put you in check? Well, if it goes here, you're going to take it. If it goes here, you're going to take it. If it goes here, you're going to take it. See how that works? Like, knights are one of the best defenders against a queen because of how they just cover all these different diagonal squares. Even if this pawn was here and he wanted to put you in check like that, guess what? The knight covers it, right? So if you ever have your king in a kind of an open space and you're being checked by a queen and you have the option to block with a knight, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a really strong move. Okay, and so just keep that in the back of your mind. This is especially helpful in blitz or speed chess, you get put in check by a queen, you have a knight that can block, boom, just play it immediately. And you know you're probably going to be safe from all these checks by your opponent's queen because the knight's going to cover it, okay? So keep that in mind when you're defending against a queen. Knights are very, very good. All right, the next tip about defending has to do with when your opponent has a passed pawn. So in this example, this pawn on c4 here is a passed pawn. It's ready to go become a queen. It's also a protected passed pawn, which is really good for black, and it's pretty dangerous. But luckily for us, we have this knight, which can blockade the pawn. And this is the rule. Knights are one of the best pieces for blockading pawns. And you can see it very clearly in this example. Notice how it's not only is it stopping the pawn, it's also putting pressure on these pawns, right? Like if this king were to ever move away, guess what? You could probably take one of these pawns. And so if you imagine like a rook was sitting here, that rook wouldn't really be doing too much, or a bishop was sitting here, or even a queen. All of those pieces are going to be kind of hindered. But remember, knights are never really hindered by pieces blocking them. So it makes sense if you blockade it, it's still going to be putting pressure on other squares. And that's why if you ever have to stop a passed pawn, look at where your knights are and see if you can get a knight to blockade it. It's usually going to be a good plan. All right, the next tip I want to give you about defending has to do with putting your knight on a certain square that really protects your king. So this is usually applies after you've castled kingside, and there's actually a little saying, and it goes, with a knight on f8, there's no mate, or the other saying is, with a knight on f1, your opponent has no fun. And basically, so we're white in this case, so it's talking about f1, and this is f8. If you're black, it would be, you know, over there. Basically what it means is when you put your knight here, it's really good at defending your king. For example, this is a common checkmate threat on your king when you've castled kingside on h2. And if your knight's on f3, yes, it can defend the pawn, but it's also much easier to be attacked, right? Like black could very easily put their bishop there, trade it off, or maybe use their rook or their knight to attack it and trade it off. The knight on f1 is very well hidden. It's hard to get to. Like, how is black going to get to this knight? Not very easily, right? And so you've got this defender that's just going to sit there as long as you need it to. And the cool thing is that if you had to block something along this file that was attacking g2, you could always move it to g3. And you get a double sort of blocks this. Very nice defensive square. Okay, so with a knight on f1, your opponent has no fun. Or if you're black, I'll flip the board for you. You know, you put your knight here with a knight on f8. There's no mate, same kind of idea. It defends and you can use it to block. Definitely keep that in mind. And it's actually really easy to do this. You just use your other knight from the other side of the board and you can hop it over in 2 squares. So you move your rook out of the way, hop your knight over, and it can just sit there and defend your king. So yeah, just keep that in mind. All right, so the next 4 tips are going to be dealing with more offensive kind of stuff. So we just looked at some sort of defensive things. Now we're going to be looking at if you're attacking, what are the things you want to keep in mind with knights. So first tip I have for you is that the queen and knight combo is one of the most powerful combos on the board. You know, just the way that the knight moves, how it can jump over pieces, and the queen, because the queen controls the ranks and files and the diagonals, and then the knight kind of hops over. It's very strong. I don't really know like exactly why. Just from experience, it just works out very well. So here's an example position. I just literally put some queens and knights on the board next to the opponent's kings. And I just want to illustrate a point. This position, whoever's move it is, they will automatically win by checkmate because the queen and knight will just win the game very easily. So in this case, it's white to play. If you want to pause, you can figure it out. What does white play here? And if you've had a chance to do that, the answer is queen to b6, which is supported by the knight, forces the king back to one of these squares. And then here, again, the knight is helping the queen deliver the checkmate. Or the other option is if the king goes over here, well, the knight comes in, right? And so you can see how this queen knight, they just work very nicely together. And then if I flip the board, here we go over here, this is black, exact same position, except now it's black's turn. And again, if you'd like to pause, there's a checkmate in 2 moves here for black as well. If you had a chance to look at that, you can take here, it forces the king here, and then the knight can come in and deliver checkmate this way. So again, we see another example of how the queen and knight very strong together. So be on the lookout. If you have opportunities, even if you have to, like, let's say sacrifice a piece, maybe to get into a position where your queen and knight are close to your opponent's king, it's usually going to be worth it. And there's usually going to be some sort of either checkmate or a really strong move. Okay, so keep that in mind. Queen and knight, very good combo. All right, the next way to use your knight is, of course, the smothered mate. You didn't think I was going to get through a video on knights without talking about this, right? So this is the common sort of example that you'll see. It comes up in other ways, like I showed you that example at the start of the video, but this is the common way when your queen is on this A2, G8 diagonal, the king has castled and kind of been pushed in the corner and your knight comes in. This is the setup that you want to look for, and that's usually when you can do the smothered mate. So the knight comes in, king goes over, and I'll let you pause at this point. If you've never seen this before, this is going to be a fun one. What should you play here as a white? And if you've had a chance to analyze that, the move is knight to h6. It's a double check, so it forces black's king to move. They can't take this knight because then it's checked with the queen. They can't take your queen because it's checked with the knight, so they have to move the king. Of course, going here leads to checkmate immediately. And then if they go in the corner, you've got queen comes in, forces the, sorry, my power is flickering. Hopefully I don't lose power and lose the video. Queen comes in, and the king can't take it because the knight is controlling it. So the rook or the knight have to take the queen, and then the knight comes in and you get this really nice smothered checkmate. If you've never seen this before, it's one of the coolest checkmates I think that there is. And you can only do it with a knight. So smothered mate, keep that in mind. Like I said, this is the common situation when your queen is on like b3 and the knight's on g5. That's when you really want to look for it. All right, the next tip I have for you is probably the most important thing that you need to understand about knights. This is a game changer once you learn this and you understand how to properly use it. So knights are most effective in outposts, okay? So pawns are very good at attacking knights. So for example, if black were to play c6, my knight is now dominated. I can't really move forward. I can't really do anything with my knight, okay? But if my opponent makes a big mistake and plays c5, they have now given me what's called an outpost. As a reminder, an outpost is a square that none of your opponent's pawns can attack. So in this example, because black has moved both of these pawns forward, they can no longer control this square, right? So my knight can just go in there, and the only way black can get rid of this knight is by trading it off for one of these pieces or sacrificing a rook or a queen or something. But I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to probably support it with my bishop. Probably going to bring this knight over, support it with my other knight, and this is fantastic. So as you're playing your games, whenever your opponent makes a pawn move, like in this case it was c5, you want to ask yourself, did they create any holes by doing that? And if the answer is yes, you want to say, okay, can I potentially get a knight in there and take advantage of that? That is huge, okay? Because without that pawn move, like let's say they play bishop c5, this is no longer anywhere close to being a good move, because now they're just going to play c6, and guess what? Now you got to move your knight, and you just wasted a move, right? So it's important that the square that you're looking at is actually an outpost, like in here, in this case it is, and that's usually where you want to put your knights. And the further up the board, or the closer into enemy territory, I guess you could say, that you can do this, the better, right? So keep that in mind, and this actually ties in with the next tip and the final tip, which is called the octopus knight. So to illustrate the octopus knight, I want to show you this game played by Garry Kasparov against Karpov. This is one of his famous games, and let's just go ahead and go quickly through the opening here. It's Sicilian, and I just want to show you the moment in the game where this happened. So right around here, notice this knight, and look at this square right here. So remember how we talked about pawns that can't control a particular square, right? There's no pawns left that white has that can control the square, okay? So Kasparov is eyeing that, and he's got the bishop lined up there. So it doesn't always have to be supported by a pawn. It can be supported by another piece. Like in this case, he's using his bishop to support the knight. But this is considered an octopus knight. An octopus knight is a knight that's like deep in enemy territory that's controlling 8 important squares. So it's maximum effectiveness. Look at this, right? 8 legs, octopus, I guess is the idea. 8 really nice squares. You're taking away these squares from the rooks. You're putting pressure on these. And you're also controlling like a bunch of just nice squares, okay? Extremely strong knight. It's like stopping everything that white would probably want to do. Maybe they would want to go here, line up here, can't do that. Maybe they would want to go here, get this rook involved, can't do that. Maybe they would want to move their queen, well then they're going to lose this pawn. I mean, it's just such a good knight, okay? And all it is just supported by this bishop, right? And so if you can get this, and notice how it's far into white's territory, right? Like if it's on the 4th or the 3rd rank if you're black, or if it would be 6th or 5th rank if you're white, that's usually a really good sign, okay? So you can just see how it's very difficult for Karpov to do anything because that knight just sits there, right? And so, you know, eventually I think there's a crazy sacrifice here. Let's see. Yeah. Basically, Karpov sacrificed his queen there, and it just, you know, Kasparov went on to win. There you go. White resigned. So, but it all had to do with that knight. I mean, that knight, and it was just over, right? Starting way back here, as soon as that knight really came in, White's position was in trouble, right? So remember that octopus knight. If you can get a knight deep in your opponent's territory that's defended well, sometimes like if there was a pawn here, that could be even better, but you don't have to. Like in this case, Kasparov just used his bishop to support it, and there just wasn't a good way for Karpov to get rid of it. And so yeah, octopus knight. Those are 10 tips for how to effectively use your knights in chess. Make sure, let me know below if I missed anything that you think is important, comment it down there. But as always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.